Hey guys, tonight we begin with the Viking world as it was actually experienced from the inside, specifically from the inside of a household that has just acquired you as property and has absolutely no interest in your feelings about that. Then we move to the most widely travelled woman of the medieval age, a Norse explorer who crossed oceans, founded settlements, walked to Rome, and somehow managed to do all of that in an era when most women were considered successful if they survived childbirth. After that you become a Viking skald, the court poet whose entire professional survival depended on praising violent men with enough accuracy to avoid becoming a cautionary verse yourself. And finally we take a long, careful look at the Viking thing, the assembly that Scandinavians held up as their great democratic institution, which it technically was, right up until you examine who got to vote, who enforced the decisions, and what happened to people who lost a case in a room full of armed men who had already made up their minds. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. I always like seeing where in the world people are watching from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. You do not remember exactly when you stopped being a person and became a problem to be managed. It happened gradually, the way most terrible things do, in small increments that each felt survivable on their own, until one day you looked up and realized the distance between where you started and where you are now is so enormous that you have stopped calculating it, because calculating it does not help. Nothing about looking backward helps. Forward is the only direction that still has any practical use, and even forward is not yours to choose. You are a thrall. That is the Norse word for it, and the Norse are very comfortable saying it plainly, without the softening language that some cultures prefer when they want to do something and also feel slightly better about doing it. A thrall is a slave. You are taken or bought or born into it, and the longhouse you now inhabit belongs to someone else, and so in every legal and practical sense do you. The longhouse itself is your first lesson in where you stand. It is a single long building low to the ground, built from timber and turf, with a central hearth running down most of its length. Smoke rises from the fire and finds its way out through a gap in the roof, or most of it does. The rest stays inside, layering itself into your clothes, your hair, your lungs, until you stop noticing it the way you stop noticing any constant discomfort. By accepting it as the new texture of the air, the building is divided by function. At one end, the family, the free people, the ones who own things. At the other end, the animals. You sleep somewhere in between, which tells you everything you need to know about how the household understands your category. It is cold in the morning. Cold in a way that is structural, not incidental. The kind of cold that lives in stone and timber and earth and does not leave just because a fire exists somewhere nearby. You wake before anyone tells you to, because something in you has already learned that being found still lying down is a problem, and problems attract attention, and attention at this stage of your existence is rarely good. So you are up, moving, hands already searching for something useful to do, because usefulness is the only currency you currently possess. The fire needs feeding. That much is obvious from the state of it. Low and orange are not particularly interested in continuing. You find the wood, stacked near the wall, and begin adding it, carefully, the way someone does when they are new enough to still be uncertain whether they are doing it correctly. The smoke thickens briefly before the fresh wood catches. Your eyes water. You do not stop. Stopping requires a reason, and watering eyes are not a reason, they are just a condition. By the time the fire is properly alive again, the household is beginning to stir. You hear it before you see it. Voices from the far end of the longhouse, the sound of children, the lower register of adults, the particular quality of morning sounds in a place where people are used to waking up together in a single shared space. You keep your head down. Not submissively exactly, but practically. There is a significant amount of information you do not yet have about this household, about its moods, its habits, its specific configurations of authority, and until you have that information, quiet observation is considerably safer than participation. The woman of the house appears first. She's carrying her keys. This detail matters more than it might seem, because in a Viking household the keys belong to the woman who runs it. They are her symbol of authority over the domestic sphere, and she holds them with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who has never for a single moment been uncertain about her position in this building. She looks at you. Not unkindly exactly, but with the particular expression of someone doing an inventory. She says something in Norse. You understand about half of it. You nod in a way that you hope communicates comprehension without committing to specifics, and she moves on, apparently satisfied or at least not dissatisfied enough to make it your immediate problem. The morning work begins without ceremony. There is no orientation. There is no explanation of where things are or how things are done or what the expectations are. There is simply the work, already in progress, already behind, and the assumption that you will locate your place in it through observation and error. You observe, you commit errors, you correct them as quickly as possible, and hope the corrections are noticed more than the errors. This is a reasonable hope. It is not always a fulfilled one. Water needs fetching. The well or the stream, whichever this settlement uses, is outside and it is cold, and the containers are heavier than they look when they are full. You carry them. Your shoulders register a complaint and then withdraw it, because there is clearly no appeals process. Grain needs grinding. This is done on a hand quern, a circular stone device that requires you to push a handle around and around while the grain works its way through, slowly, tediously, with the particular rhythm of a task that was designed by someone who had given up on the concept of efficiency. Your arms begin to hurt roughly 6 minutes into it. The grinding takes considerably longer than 6 minutes. Animals need feeding. The livestock in their section of the longhouse, cattle and sheep and sometimes pigs, have their own requirements, their own smells, their own opinions about mornings, which are largely negative and expressed loudly. You navigate around them, filling troughs, clearing what needs clearing, trying not to slip on surfaces that would very much like you to slip on them. The smell is comprehensive. After a while, it becomes less of a smell and more of a climate. By mid-morning, you have been awake for what feels like most of the day, and the actual day is only just beginning. You eat when there is eating to be done, and what you eat is whatever remains after the household has eaten, which is sometimes adequate and sometimes technically qualifies as food. You sit at the far end from the family and you eat quickly, because sitting for too long in a place where there is always something to do is itself a kind of statement, and you are not ready yet to make statements. The hierarchy of the household is something you map slowly, the way you would map unfamiliar terrain, by walking across it and noting where the ground is stable and where it gives way unexpectedly. At the top is the householder, the Carl, the free man who owns this land and everything on it, including you. He is not home this morning, which is itself information. He is somewhere that free men go when they have the freedom to go places. Below him, his wife, who runs the domestic world with the kind of competence that comes from having done it for years, without anyone offering to help. Below her, their children, who are children and therefore unpredictable in the specific way children are unpredictable, which is to say that their cruelty when it appears is not malicious, just experimental. And then there are the other thralls. There are 2 others in this household, and this is one of the first genuinely useful pieces of information you acquire, because it means you're not the newest problem, you are just the most recent one. One of them has been here long enough to move through the space with a kind of quiet efficiency that is different from your own tentative navigation. She knows where things are, she knows what is expected, she does not look at you with warmth exactly, but she does not look at you with hostility either, and in your current situation, neutral is close enough to welcome that you take it as such. The other has been here longer still, long enough to have developed a relationship with the household that is complicated in ways you do not yet understand. He helps with different things than you do, things that require being trusted with more valuable objects and more sensitive tasks, which means he has spent time earning something, even if what he has earned is a slightly less uncomfortable version of an already uncomfortable situation. You watch him carefully, not because you plan to copy his path, but because his path is currently the only evidence you have that paths exist. The Norse relationship with thralls is, like most things about the Norse, more complicated than it appears from the outside. The sagas are full of thralls who are clearly people, with personalities and loyalties and moments of genuine dignity, and also full of casual references to thralls being treated as objects, bought and sold and inherited like furniture. Both things are true simultaneously, which is a feature of the system rather than a contradiction in it. A thrall could, in theory, buy their freedom. Some did. Some were freed by their owners, for reasons that range from genuine affection to the practical calculation that a freed person still bound by social obligation could sometimes be more useful than an owned one. But those were exceptions, and exceptions by definition do not describe the experience of the many. The work does not stop when the light does. This is something you learn on your first evening, when the sun begins its slow decline and you feel, briefly, that the day might be ending, and then the evening meals begin to be prepared, and the fire needs attending and the animals need settling for the night, and there is still spinning to be done, because there is always spinning to be done, wool into thread, into cloth, into clothing, the textile work that runs like a quiet river beneath the surface of every Norse household, and that thrall women and free women and the wife of the householder all do together, sometimes in the same room, the one activity that crosses categories without erasing them. The spinning wheel, or more accurately the drop spindle, which is what most people use in this period, requires a particular kind of attention, present enough to keep the tension consistent, relaxed enough to be sustainable over hours. You're not good at it yet. The thread breaks twice. You rejoin it, carefully, watching the woman beside you to see how she handles hers, copying the angle of her wrist, the pull of her fingers, the rhythm. She notices. She does not comment, but she slows down slightly, just enough to make the motion easier to follow. This is the smallest kindness, and also one of the most useful things anyone has done for you since you arrived, and you file it away with the seriousness it deserves. Night settles over the longhouse like a blanket being drawn across something large and complicated. The fire is lower now, banked for the night, still warm but no longer demanding. People arrange themselves for sleep, the family at their end, the thralls at theirs, the animals shifting in their section with the restless movements of creatures who have never quite made peace with being indoors. You lie down on what is essentially a sleeping platform with a thin layer of straw, and you pull your cloak around yourself and you stare at the darkness of the ceiling, or where the ceiling would be if you could see it. Your body is exhausted in a specific and total way that feels unfamiliar compared to whatever exhaustion you knew before. This is not the tiredness of a long day. This is the tiredness of a day that asked things of your body it was not built to give, repeatedly, without pause, until giving was simply what your body did instead of anything else. Your shoulders ache from the water, from the grain, from the constant movement. Your hands are rougher than they were yesterday. Your feet have developed opinions about the floor that they did not have when you arrived. But here is the strange thing, and it is strange enough that you notice it even through the exhaustion. The day had a shape. It had a beginning and a middle and an end, and within that shape you knew, mostly, what was expected of you. And you met most of those expectations, and the ones you did not meet you failed at in ways that were correctable rather than catastrophic. That is not freedom. It is not dignity, not in any full sense, but it is a kind of legibility. The rules of this world, brutal as they are, can be understood, and understanding them is the beginning of surviving them. It is not much. Tonight, it is enough. The days that follow your first one do not get easier in the way you had hoped, which is to say they do not get easier at all in any measurable sense. They get different. That is something. Your muscles adapt, not comfortably, not enthusiastically, but with the grim competence of tissues that have understood their situation and decided, however grudgingly, to cooperate. The water feels no lighter after the first week. The grain quern does not develop a sense of humour, but your hands stop complaining at the same volume they did in the beginning, which is the nearest thing to progress available in your circumstances. You learn the household's rhythms. This matters more than any single skill, because the rhythms are the frame inside which everything else happens, and knowing them means you can anticipate rather than react. Anticipation, in your position, is the difference between being where you need to be before you are needed and being found somewhere you should not be when something goes wrong. The margin between those two things is thin and consequential. The householder returns on the fourth day. He's larger than you expected, in the way that men who work outdoors and eat regularly often are, solid rather than tall, with the kind of presence that is less about size and more about the assumption, built in over years, that rooms will arrange themselves around him. He looks at you when he arrives in the way that men who own things look at new acquisitions, not unkindly, but with the particular quality of assessment that is different from the way he would look at a person he was deciding whether to like. You hold still under the assessment. There is no useful response to an inventory. He speaks to his wife for a few minutes in the low, rapid exchange of people who have been communicating efficiently for years, and have dispensed with the parts of conversation that require explanation. She gestures toward you at some point. He looks again, briefly, and then nods, and then they move on to other subjects. You have been noted and accepted as a fact of the household. This is not warmth, but it is stability, and stability in your current situation is more useful than warmth by a considerable margin. Work in a Norse household is not simple in the way that a list of tasks makes it sound. The individual tasks are comprehensible enough: fetch water, grind grain, feed animals, prepare food, clean, spin, card wool, repair things that have broken, help with whatever is currently most urgent, but the texture of doing all of this continuously, from before dawn to after dark, in a space you do not own, alongside people you are still learning, is something that exists in the gap between describing a task and living inside it. You're always in motion or preparing for motion. There is no portion of the day that is reliably yours, no corner of time that has been set aside for the purpose of being a person rather than a function. The food question evolves. In your first days you received whatever was left after the household ate, and whatever was left was variable in both quantity and quality. As the weeks pass, the distribution becomes more predictable, not more generous, but more legible. You know now that the morning meal will happen after certain tasks are done. You know which tasks come first and which can be delayed, and which must not be delayed under any circumstances. You eat with the other thralls, quickly, practically, without the performance of enjoyment that eating can be when enjoyment is available as an option. You eat because you need to continue, and continuing requires fuel, and this is the fuel. On the good days, it is even adequate. The other thralls are your most important source of information, and also the most difficult to read, because their situation is complicated in ways that yours is not yet complicated enough to fully understand. The woman who has been here for years, the one who slowed down her spinning slightly on your first evening to let you follow, her name is something you eventually learned to pronounce correctly after 2 weeks of quiet approximation that she tolerated without comment. She moves through the household like someone who knows exactly how much space she's entitled to, and has long since stopped wanting more of it. There is a peace in how she operates, though peace is perhaps not quite the right word: adaptation. She has adapted so completely that the adaptation has become her shape. She helps you without making much of it, which is the most useful kind of help. She shows you where things are stored, not by saying here is where things are stored, but by simply retrieving them in front of you, in a way that makes their location obvious. She corrects your technique on the cairn without commentary, by adjusting her own hands while standing next to you, demonstrating through motion rather than language. This costs her nothing, and saves you significant time, and the fact that she provides it at all says something about the specific quality of solidarity that can exist between people in shared circumstances, which is not the solidarity of equals, but the solidarity of people who understand each other's situation without needing it explained. The man who has been here longest is more complicated. He has a standing in the household that exists entirely in the unwritten layer of daily life, the layer where things are understood without being said. He is trusted with the horses, which is not a small thing, because horses in the Norse world are valuable, temperamental, and capable of doing significant damage to anyone who handles them without knowing what they're doing. He also handles the tools, the better tools, the ones made of iron rather than wood, that the household treats with a seriousness that reflects both their value and the difficulty of replacing them. This trust was built over time, slowly, through the consistent demonstration of competence and reliability, and it has produced for him something that the system does not officially recognize, but that exists nonetheless, a kind of informal authority within the lower tier of the household. He does not volunteer information. He will answer a direct question if you phrase it carefully enough, but volunteering is not his mode. You learn from him primarily by watching, which is how most things are learned in environments where nobody has time to explain. He has a way of moving around the horses that you find yourself copying, not because anyone told you to, but because it clearly works, and things that clearly work in your situation command a kind of respect that is entirely practical. The Norse household operates according to a logic of productivity that has very little patience for its own gaps. There is always something that needs doing, and the things that need doing have a hierarchy that shifts depending on the time of year, the weather, the state of the stores and the plans of the householder, which you're not always informed of in advance. You become good at reading the secondary signals, the particular tension in how the householder's wife moves through the longhouse when something important is being organised, the way the other thralls adjust their pace when the day is about to become more demanding than usual, the smell of the weather changing through the smoke hole in the roof, which tells you something about the afternoon before the afternoon arrives. Winter is different. You arrive at the edge of it and feel the change coming before it formally arrives, in the quality of light, which shifts from pale to thin to something that barely deserves the word. The days shorten so fast in northern Iceland that the compression of light feels almost violent, a joke being played by the season on anyone who depended on daylight to mark their time. The work does not decrease with the light. If anything, it intensifies in certain respects, because winter requires preparation and maintenance that summer does not, and because confined animals in confined spaces require more attention than animals that can largely manage themselves outdoors. The cold inside the longhouse is not the same as the cold outside. Outside, the cold is sharp and clear and honest about what it is. Inside, the cold is a negotiation, the fire warm at its centre and the walls cold at their edges, and your body trying to find a position relative to both that is survivable without being impossible. You sleep near the fire, which means you sleep near the animals, which is its own sensory experience, but the warmth is not negotiable. You have stopped thinking about the warmth as a preference. It is a necessity. Preferences are for people with choices. There is a moment, around 6 weeks into your time in the household, when something shifts, not dramatically, not with ceremony, but perceptibly. The householder's wife hands you the keys to the grain store and tells you to count what remains and report back. This is not freedom. It is not recognition in any formal sense. But it is a task that requires trust, in the limited sense that trust operates in this kind of relationship, and being given it means something has been assessed and found sufficient. You count carefully, you report accurately. She receives the information without comment, which is itself a kind of acknowledgement. You begin to understand what the man who handles the horses already knows, and what the woman who slowed her spinning understands in her own way. You're not going to be free, not in any foreseeable future, and possibly not ever. The legal mechanisms that allow for manumission, the formal freeing of a thrall, exist in theory but require a decision from the household that cannot be compelled from below. You cannot make yourself free by being good enough. What you can do is make yourself valuable enough that the quality of your daily existence shifts in small but meaningful ways. More responsibility, which means more trust, which means slightly more latitude, which means days that look slightly more like days with shape and slightly less like days with only function. This is not the same as freedom. The sagas are very clear on that distinction, in the ways they record thralls who are freed after long service, and the ways they record thralls who are not. But it is what is available, and you have spent enough weeks in this household now to understand the difference between refusing what is available on principle and accepting it as the shape of your actual life. The principle belongs to a different version of you, one who had options. This version has the longhouse and the fire and the grain queen and the slow, careful accumulation of being known. The short Norse days of deep winter close down around the household like a fist. Outside, the world is dark for most of what would elsewhere be called daytime. Inside, the fire burns continuously, the only reliable source of both warmth and light, and the household gathers around it in the evenings with the particular closeness of people who share both space and necessity. The free members of the household tell stories, as Norse households do in winter, the long tradition of oral narrative that fills the dark months with the sound of human voices recounting things that happened or might have happened or were useful to imagine having happened. You sit at your distance and listen to what you can follow and let the sound of the rest wash over you as simple texture. Stories in a language you are still learning are still stories. The warmth of a room where stories are being told does not require comprehension to reach you. Spring, when it comes, feels like a physical argument won. Light returning in increments, each day marginally longer than the last. The particular quality of morning shifting from something you endure to something you can almost look forward to. The animals go back outside, the work changes shape, the household breathes differently, moves differently, occupies its space with a looseness that winter had contracted into itself. You feel it too, something that is not quite relief but is adjacent to it. The recognition that you survived the season, which was the goal, which you accomplished, and which means the next thing is possible. You have been in this household for a winter now. You know where everything is. You know what is expected of you and when. You know which tasks carry significance and which are invisible, and which must be done perfectly, and which can be done adequately without anyone caring about the difference. You know the other thralls and they know you. You know enough Norse to follow most of what is said in normal conversation, and to manage most of what you need to communicate yourself. You're not free, you're not equal, you're not someone for whom this life was designed. But you are here, and you have learned the shape of here, and that learning is the only form of ownership that cannot be taken from you without also taking you. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. This is the reality of thrall life that the sagas gesture at without ever dwelling in. Not the dramatic moments, not the moments of rebellion or freedom or cruelty or unexpected kindness that make good stories, but the long, undramatic middle of it. The days that are just days, the work that is just work, the slow accumulation of a life lived entirely within the constraints of someone else's choices. The Norse built a society that was in many ways vital and creative and genuinely impressive, and they built it on top of this, on the labour of people who woke before dawn with aching muscles and fed fires that warmed rooms they did not own and ground grain for bread they ate last. History has a way of making the bottom of things invisible, not through active suppression, but through the simple fact that the people at the bottom did not write the sagas. Other people wrote the sagas, about other people, and the thralls are there, in the edges, in the background, mentioned when relevant and not mentioned when not, present in every scene and nowhere near the centre. You are in the edges. You know the centre exists because you can see it from where you are. And knowing the centre exists and understanding your distance from it is its own kind of education. Not comfortable, not what you would have chosen, but real, in the way that things are real when you cannot look away from them. Real and yours, in the only sense that anything can be yours when everything else belongs to someone else. This is the morning. Again, you already know what comes next. The Norse conception of thralldom was not, to be clear, gentle in its origins or mild in its execution. Thralls were obtained primarily through raiding, which is to say they were people who'd been living their own lives in their own communities, in Ireland or England or Scotland or the Frankish territories or the Slavic lands to the east, and then a ship arrived, and those lives ended and different lives began. The abruptness of this transition is not something the sagas linger on, partly because the sagas were written by and for people who participated in the raiding economy and had interests in not lingering on it, and partly because what the sagas were interested in was the Viking world from the inside, and from the inside a thrall was a feature of daily life rather than a moral crisis requiring extended reflection. The moral crisis, such as it was in the Norse framework, existed elsewhere. The Norse did have ethical ideas about the proper treatment of thralls that went beyond simple economic calculation. There was an idea that a thrall well treated was more productive and more loyal than a thrall mistreated, which is a pragmatic observation rather than a moral one, but it produced some of the same behaviours. There was also the reality that thralls who were treated with consistent cruelty had options that were limited but not non-existent, including the option of simply running away, which thralls did with enough regularity that the laws addressing the problem of runaway thralls are fairly detailed, suggesting that the problem was common enough to require a legal framework. A thrall who ran away and was caught faced severe punishment. A thrall who ran away and was not caught faced the problem of being an identifiable foreigner in a society where everyone knew everyone else, and strangers were noted immediately. In Iceland especially, where the population was small and the geography was harsh and the communities were isolated enough that an unfamiliar face was genuinely conspicuous, running away was less a plan than a gesture, one that required extraordinary good fortune to become an actual escape rather than a brief delay before recapture. Some thralls were foreign in ways that were visually unmistakable, dark-haired Irish women among fair Icelanders, or large Slavic men in communities where the physical type was recognisable. Others were Norse, or could pass for Norse, taken from communities close enough in language and appearance that integration, under sufficiently different circumstances, might have been possible. The Norse did not have the racial categories that later forms of slavery would construct around the institution to make it seem more permanent and more natural than it was. A freed thrall became a freed person with a different legal status but not a different category of humanity. The line between slave and free was legal and social, not biological, which did not make it easier to cross but did make it differently shaped. The children of thralls were thralls. This was the mechanism by which the institution reproduced itself without requiring constant new raids, and it created within Norse society a class of people who had never known anything else, who had been born into the longhouse and who knew the work and the rules and the rhythms of the household from infancy. These people had, in some ways, an easier relationship with their situation than the adults who had been taken from other lives because they had no other life to remember. They also had, in some ways, a harder one, because they had no frame of reference that suggested the situation could be different, no internal before and after that preserved some sense of what freedom was even when freedom itself was gone. You are not one of these. You had a before. You remember it, sometimes at inconvenient times, when a smell or a sound or the quality of light at a particular hour reaches through the distance between then and now and deposits something in your chest that is neither grief nor anger, but belongs to the same family as both. You handle these moments the way you handle most things now, which is to let them pass without making them into anything, because the alternative is to make them into something and then be left with something you cannot afford to carry while also carrying water from the stream. The Norse word for the act of freeing a thrall is lausen, which also means ransom, which also means release, which suggests something about how the Norse understood the relationship between people and their legal conditions as something that could be held or released by the right person at the right price. The price of your laulen, if it ever came, would be determined by the household, not by you. You have no legal standing to negotiate for your own freedom. You can demonstrate value, earn trust, accumulate the kind of invisible social capital that sometimes translates into the decision by the household to grant what you cannot demand. Or you can wait for something to change, which is a different kind of waiting than most, because you do not know what the change would look like or when it would come or whether it would come at all. The Norse also freed thralls at death. A householder who died might in their final arrangements grant freedom to valued thralls as a last act of generosity or piety, or simple practical recognition that a thrall who had served well deserved something for that service. This was not a legal obligation, it was a choice, and choices made at death are, almost by definition, made by someone who is no longer available to discuss whether the choice was adequate. In the meantime, you carry water, you grind grain, you feed the fire, you spin wool in the evenings with the sound of the household settling around you, the children falling asleep first, then the adults, then the long breathing of people who have spent the day in physical labour and who sleep the particular sleep of the genuinely tired, which is not peaceful exactly but is thorough. You lie in your place near the fire and the animals, and you feel the heat on one side and the cold on the other, and you adjust yourself to find the position that is most sustainable, which is not the most comfortable, because the most comfortable is not available. The most sustainable is what you are after. It is what you are always after. Outside, the Norse world continues. The raids go out and come back. The ships cross and recross the North Atlantic. The sagas take shape in people's mouths, passed from household to household through the winter dark. The thing assembles every summer and decides things about people who are not there to speak for themselves, including people like you, whose legal existence is managed entirely by others. History is being made everywhere, in the decisions of powerful men and the voyages of extraordinary women and the halls of jarls where skalds are composing verses that will outlast everyone in the room, and you are in the corner of a longhouse, doing the things that need to be done, which are many and constant and invisible to the history that is being made around you. The invisible work is still work. This is a truth that requires no particular wisdom to understand, but that does require a particular kind of steadiness to live inside every day. You understand it, not philosophically, not with the distance of someone thinking about it from outside. You understand it the way you understand cold and hunger, which is directly, immediately through the body. The body knows. You wake up again tomorrow, the work begins again. You are still here. That is not nothing. That continues to be not nothing. Not every Norse woman of the saga age disappeared quietly into a household and left no further impression on the historical record. Some of them were loud, some of them were difficult, and a very few of them were so genuinely extraordinary that even the sagas, which were written by men in a culture that had complicated feelings about extraordinary women, could not quite bring themselves to leave them out. Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir was born in Iceland sometime around the late 900s, the daughter of a prosperous Norse settler in a land that was itself barely a generation old. Iceland at this time was a society still actively inventing itself, a place where people who had left Norway for a combination of reasons, including genuine adventurousness, political inconvenience, and the kind of personality that finds established societies too limiting, were building something new at the edge of the known world. Gudrid grew up in this environment, which may explain something about what she later became, because a society that considers settling Iceland a reasonable life choice has a somewhat different relationship with the concept of too far than most. She married young, as women of her class did. Her first husband was a man named Thorir, and they travelled together to Greenland, which had been settled by the famously difficult Eric the Red roughly a decade earlier. Greenland, despite the name that Eric had chosen with what historians generally agree was impressive optimism, was not a hospitable place. The settlement clung to the southwestern coast, where the climate was marginally less lethal, and the Norse who lived there were engaged in the continuous low-level struggle of maintaining a community at the absolute edge of what a Viking Age society could sustain. Thorir died on the voyage or shortly after arriving. The sources are not entirely clear on the details, and this ambiguity is characteristic of what we know about Gudrid's life, which comes primarily from two sagas, the Saga of the Greenlanders and Eric the Red's saga, documents that agree on broad outlines and disagree enthusiastically on specifics. What is clear is that by the time she arrived in Greenland, Gudrid was a widow, young, capable, and alone in a settlement at the edge of the world. She did not stay a widow for long. She came under the protection of Eric the Red's household, and it was there that she met Leif Erikson, Eric's son, the man who had already made the first Norse voyage to the North American continent, a place the Norse called Vinland, the land of grapes or wild berries, somewhere along the coast of what is now Canada or the northeastern United States. Leif did not marry her for reasons the sagas do not fully explain, but it was through his household that she met her second husband, a man named Thorvald, and later, after Thorvald also died, her third, a man named Thorfinn Karlsefni, who would become central to the next chapter of her story. Thorfinn was an Icelandic merchant of good standing, ambitious and practical in roughly equal measure. He had arrived in Greenland with trade goods and left with something considerably more significant. The two married in Greenland, and almost immediately began organising the most ambitious Norse expedition to Vinland yet attempted. This was not a scouting voyage. This was an attempt at permanent settlement. They brought livestock. They brought enough people to form a genuine community. They intended to stay. What they found in Vinland was not the empty continent they may have imagined. The Norse sagas refer to the indigenous people they encountered as Skraelings, a word whose exact meaning is debated, but whose tone is clearly dismissive in the way that the vocabulary of colonial encounters usually is. The initial contact was cautious, then tentative, then briefly commercial. The Norse traded red cloth for animal furs, which seemed to please everyone, right up until a bull belonging to the Norse settlers broke loose and terrified the Skraelings into a panic, which led to violence, which led to more violence, which was the general direction these encounters tended to move when one group arrived with metal weapons and the intention of staying permanently. Gudrid was present for all of this. She was present when negotiations went well and when they collapsed. She was present for the birth of her son Snorri, the first European child known to have been born in the Americas, a detail that the sagas record with notable matter-of-factness, as if being born on a previously unknown continent was slightly less remarkable than being born during a difficult winter. She was present when it became clear that the Vinland settlement was not going to work, not because the land was inhospitable, but because the indigenous population was numerous, capable, and understandably unwilling to share their coastline with armed strangers who had arrived uninvited and shown no signs of leaving. The Norse abandoned Vinland after 3 years. Thorfinn Karlsefni took his family back to Iceland, where he prospered. Gudrid raised her son. She became, by all accounts, a woman of considerable standing in Icelandic society, which already placed her in a category most people of her era never reached, but she was not finished. At some point in her later life, Gudrid made a pilgrimage to Rome. This was not a small undertaking. The journey from Iceland to Rome in the 11th century required crossing the North Atlantic, navigating to the British Isles or the continent, and then travelling overland through Europe to reach the papal city. People made this journey. It was not unprecedented, but it was long, difficult, dangerous, and expensive, and most people who did it were men with resources and organisational support. Gudrid did it. The sagas say she was well received by the Pope himself, which may be hagiographic embellishment of the kind that tends to collect around remarkable women once they are safely dead and cannot complicate the story. But even if that specific detail is inflated, the journey itself is recorded with enough consistency to be accepted as historical. She went. She returned. She then entered a convent and became an anchoress, spending her remaining years in religious devotion. The arc of her life is extraordinary in ways that resist easy summary. She was born in Iceland. She travelled to Greenland. She travelled to North America. She gave birth there. She returned to Iceland, raised a family, and then walked or sailed or rowed across half the known world to reach Rome. And then she came home and lived quietly. No single category fits her. Not the passive Norse woman of romantic imagination, not the warrior figure of popular fiction, not the saint, not the explorer in the modern heroic sense. She was a person who moved through the world as it was actually structured, using what she had, enduring what she could not change, and covering in the course of a single human life more of the Earth's surface than almost anyone alive in her century. Her descendants, these sagas tell us, became bishops. Her son Snorri's line produced churchmen, which is the kind of outcome that the medieval mind considered evidence of divine favour, proof that a life had been well spent. What Gudrid herself thought about that assessment is not recorded. The sagas are full of things people did not say. What we know about Gudrid's early life is filtered through the particular lens of the family sagas, a genre that is more novelistic in its instincts than strictly historiographical, and that tends to remember women in terms of their relationships with the men around them, until those women do something sufficiently remarkable that even the saga tradition cannot quite omit it. Gudrid did enough remarkable things that she appears in two separate sagas with reasonable consistency, which is a form of validation the era did not provide casually. The details that the two sagas agree on are probably true. The details they disagree on belong to the interpretive fog that surrounds almost everything in this period, and sitting with that fog is part of understanding the story honestly. Her father, Thorbjorn, was a prosperous Icelandic farmer, which in the context of late 10th century Iceland meant someone who had either participated in the original settlement or descended from those who had, who controlled enough land to be independent, and who occupied a position in the community that was respectable without being politically dominant. Gudrid grew up in this household with the particular education that Icelandic daughters of good standing received, which included domestic competence, knowledge of the sagas and the oral tradition, and the kind of resilience that life in Iceland simply required as a baseline, because the climate had no patience for people who lacked it. She was, the sagas suggest, an unusually capable person from early on, though the sagas are the kind of sources that tend to project capability backward onto people who later demonstrated it, which means we should be appropriately cautious about the portrait of the exceptional child. What we can say is that when her life became genuinely difficult, which it did with the regularity of someone who kept moving toward the edges of the world, she managed the difficulty in ways that were clearly not accidental. Her first voyage, the one that took her to Greenland with Thora, her first husband, was already more travel than most people of her era would accomplish in a lifetime. The North Atlantic crossing in an open Norse vessel was not a journey undertaken without reason. The ships were magnificent feats of engineering for their time, shallow drafted and flexible, built to work with the sea rather than against it, capable of crossing open ocean in ways that the heavier vessels of Mediterranean tradition could not. But they were also cold, wet, exposed to weather that could turn lethal in the time it takes to decide whether the clouds on the horizon are a problem. Passengers endured the crossing rather than enjoyed it. Gudrid endured it with Thora and arrived in Greenland as a widow or widowed shortly after arrival, a detail the sagas handle with the brevity of people for whom death in the course of a journey was not unusual enough to require extended commentary. Greenland at the time of her arrival was a community of a few thousand Norse settlers, clustered primarily in two regions of the southwestern coast, where the climate, by Greenland standards, was hospitable enough to allow farming. Eric the Red had founded the settlement roughly a decade earlier, after his term of outlawry from Iceland, and had spent the intervening years recruiting settlers and building the political structure of the community from the position of its most prominent founding figure. His farm at Brattahlid in the eastern settlement was the social and political centre of Norse Greenland, and it was into this orbit that Gudrid moved after her husband's death. The sagas record an episode during her time in Greenland that has drawn considerable scholarly attention, not because it is typical of what we know about Gudrid, but because it sits so incongruously against everything else. During a period of hardship in the settlement, a seeress or vulva was brought in to perform a divination ceremony, a form of ritual magic called cedar that had deep roots in Norse religious practice and that involved entering a trance state to communicate with spirits and foretell the future. Gudrid, the sagas say, was asked to sing a specific charm song as part of the ritual, a song she knew from her foster mother, a song from a tradition she did not personally practice. She hesitated. She eventually agreed. Her singing, the saga reports, was so effective that the seeress was able to perform her work successfully, and the community received the reassuring prophecy they needed. The episode is fascinating for several reasons, none of which are simple. Gudrid later converted to Christianity, and the Christian faith she held for the rest of her life was genuine and consequential, culminating in her pilgrimage to Rome and her years as an anchoress. How did that person fit with the young woman who sang a pagan charm in a darkened hall in Greenland? The sagas seem to feel some discomfort with this question, and handle it by noting that Gudrid acknowledged the song as belonging to a tradition she did not endorse, even as she performed it. Whether this is historical reporting or retrospective theological management by Christian saga writers is exactly the kind of question that the sources cannot answer. What the episode does show is a person navigating the practical realities of her community, even when those realities did not align with her own inclinations, which is a quality that the rest of her life also demonstrates. Her marriage to Thorfinn Karlsefni is the pivot point of her story in the way that such things pivot. Not because romance is the mechanism, but because Thorfinn was the man who made the Vinland expedition possible, and who brought Gudrid with him into the most extraordinary chapter of her life. Thorfinn was, by all accounts, a serious and capable man, an Icelandic merchant of genuine standing who had arrived in Greenland with a ship full of trade goods and departed with a wife, a plan, and enough ambition to try to do what Leif Erikson had not sustained: establish a permanent Norse presence on the North American continent. The expedition assembled at Greenland. Multiple ships were involved, multiple families, livestock, tools, and enough supplies to sustain a community through the first difficult year of a new settlement. The people who signed on for this were not, in most cases, adventurers in the romantic sense. They were farmers and craftspeople and their families, people who had calculated that the risks of crossing the ocean and establishing themselves in a new land were acceptable compared to the alternatives available to them in Iceland or Greenland. The mathematics of frontier settlement are always this particular kind of grim. The known situation is difficult enough that the unknown situation seems worth trying. They landed at various points along the North American coast, names from the sagas attached to places that archaeologists and historians have debated for decades: Helluland and Markland and Vinland proper, a stretch of coastline where wild grapes or berries grew abundantly enough to name the place after them. The location of Vinland has been disputed since scholars began taking the sagas seriously as historical documents, but the discovery of a Norse settlement at Lonso Meadows in Newfoundland in the 1960s provided the first definitive archaeological evidence that the Norse had in fact reached North America, centuries before Columbus, in exactly the period the sagas described. The site at Lonso Meadows is not certainly Vinland itself, which may have been further south, but it establishes beyond serious doubt that the Norse were there. Gudrid was there. Whatever the precise geography, she was part of the settlement for 3 years, the longest sustained Norse presence on the continent. She managed a household at the edge of the world. She gave birth to Snorri, her son by Thorfinn, in a land that European civilization would not officially discover for another 400 years. The sagas record this with the same matter-of-factness they bring to everything, a detail noted rather than celebrated, as if being the first European woman to give birth in the Americas were the kind of thing that happened occasionally and did not require extended reflection. The saga writers had their own priorities. The weight of what they recorded casually lands differently across the centuries. The relationship with the Skraelings, the indigenous people the Norse encountered, was the central problem of the Vinland settlement and the reason it ultimately failed. The initial meetings had the tentative quality of contact between groups that have no shared language, no established framework for relationship, and no particular reason to trust each other. Trade happened. The Norse offered red cloth in exchange for furs, and the exchange was apparently satisfying to both parties for long enough to create the impression that a working relationship might develop. Gudrid was present for some of these encounters, and the sagas place her in a specific scene that has attracted considerable attention. A Skraeling woman came to the Norse settlement and sought out Gudrid specifically, asking through gesture and the limited communication available to them who she was. Gudrid told her her name. The Skraeling woman repeated it, smiled, and then left. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. When the violent confrontation that ended the trading relationship broke out nearby, the detail is so small and so specific that it has the texture of something that actually happened, preserved through generations of oral transmission, because it was memorable and human in a way that larger historical events sometimes are not. Two women, speaking across an unbridgeable language barrier, exchanging names at the edge of an encounter that was about to turn violent, and both of them knowing it before it happened. The Norse abandoned Vinland. The decision was not instantaneous or unanimous, but the logic was inescapable. The indigenous population was numerous, organised, and entirely capable of making the Norse position untenable through persistent pressure, which they did. The Norse advantage in metal weapons was real, but not decisive at the scale of sustained conflict with a larger population that knew the land intimately. 3 years in, the settlement concluded what it had perhaps known for some time. This particular version of the future was not going to work. Thorfinn and Gudrid returned to Iceland, where Thorfinn built a successful farm and Gudrid raised her children, and the extraordinary nature of what she had done settled gradually into the background of a life that had other demands. Thorfinn eventually died, and Gudrid's children grew up, and the household she had built continued, and at some point in this interval, the decision formed that would produce the final chapter of her remarkable life. The pilgrimage to Rome. The decision to make this journey was not casual. Rome was not adjacent to Iceland. Getting there required crossing the North Atlantic, navigating to the British Isles or the continent, and then travelling overland through Europe, through lands that in the early 11th century were not uniformly hospitable to lone travellers of any description. Gudrid was not young when she made this journey, though her exact age at the time is unknown. She had already crossed the North Atlantic multiple times. She had already lived in multiple countries across multiple continents. She did not appear to have developed the attachment to staying in one place that eventually claims most people. She went. The sagas tell us she was well received, and that the Pope expressed admiration for what he was told about her history, which may or may not have happened in precisely those terms, but which the saga tradition clearly felt was the appropriate response to the person it had been recording for several generations. She returned to Iceland, and then she became an anchoress, living in a cell attached to a church that her son Snorri built for her on the family land, spending her remaining years in prayer and contemplation, visible but withdrawn, present but apart. The anchoress life in medieval Christianity was a serious and specific vocation. It was not retirement. It was a form of religious commitment as demanding in its own way as anything else Gudrid had done, an enclosure chosen deliberately and maintained throughout the remainder of life. For a woman who had spent her entire adult life in motion, crossing oceans and continents, founding settlements and surviving their collapse, raising children in 3 countries, and walking across Europe on pilgrimage, the decision to stop moving was not a surrender of ambition, but a particular completion of it. She had seen more of the world than almost anyone alive in her century. She knew what was out there. She chose, at the end, to go inward. Her descendants became clergy. Her saga was told and retold and eventually written down. She was not forgotten, not entirely, even as the centuries accumulated between her life and ours, even as the Norse world she inhabited transformed and contracted, and eventually became the modern Scandinavian nations with their ferry connections and their central heating. The woman who crossed the North Atlantic in an open boat, who named herself to a Skraeling woman at the edge of violence, who raised the first European child born in the Americas, who walked to Rome and back, left enough of an impression on the people who knew her, and the people who knew those people, that something of her survived the distance. That survival is its own kind of achievement, separate from the voyages and the settlements, separate from the pilgrimage and the anchoress cell, to be remembered is not simple. Most people who lived in Gudrid's era were not remembered. They did their work and raised their children and died in their longhouses or at sea, or of the ordinary diseases of the medieval world, and the sagas did not record them because the sagas were interested in the exceptional, and most lives are not exceptional in the ways that sagas recognise. Gudrid's was. Not because she was born to power or killed anyone important or transformed the political structure of her era, but because she moved through the world with a consistency of purpose and capacity that left marks in enough different places that eventually those marks added up to a story that people wanted to tell. We still want to tell it, that is not nothing. The world that produced Gudrid Thorbjarnardottir was in some ways more open to the exceptional individual than the world that replaced it. Norse society, for all its hierarchies and its casual brutality toward people it classified as thralls or enemies, maintained for free women a legal standing that was, by contemporary European standards, notably substantial. A Norse woman of free status could own property in her own name. She could divorce a husband under specific circumstances by declaring the divorce publicly in front of witnesses, a procedure that required genuine cause but that existed and was used. She could manage a household in her husband's absence with full legal authority, which was not ceremonial but practical because husbands were absent frequently, at sea, on raids, trading, travelling, dying, and someone had to run the farm. This legal and practical standing did not translate into equality in the modern sense or anywhere close to it, but it did translate into something that is harder to name precisely, a certain expectation of competence, a cultural understanding that women were capable of managing complex situations, that their judgment mattered, that their decisions had consequences which they were responsible for. The Norse housewife who ran her household while her husband was at sea was not a passive presence waiting for him to come back and resume authority. She was the authority, and everyone in the community understood this as normal rather than exceptional. Gudrid's life demonstrates what this kind of standing could become in the hands of someone with exceptional ability and extraordinary luck in circumstances. She was not born to power in the political sense. Her father was prosperous but not dominant. She had no special connections that would have smoothed her path. What she had was capability, a series of situations that required capability, and the willingness to apply one to the other without apparently spending much time in doubt about whether she was entitled to do so. The Greenland of her middle years was a community under constant pressure from multiple directions. The climate was genuinely difficult, marginally habitable rather than comfortably settled, producing enough food in good years to sustain the population, but not enough margin to absorb bad ones with equanimity. The Norse Greenland settlements would eventually collapse entirely, disappearing sometime in the 14th or 15th century for reasons that scholars continue to debate: climate change and the arrival of the Black Death and possible conflict with the expanding Thrall people, all proposed as contributing factors. The community that Gudrid moved through was still in its relatively optimistic early period, but the vulnerability that would eventually destroy it was structural from the beginning. The trade networks that connected Greenland to the wider Norse world were thin and dependent on ships that could be lost, on weather that could prevent crossings for entire seasons, on the willingness of Icelandic and Norwegian merchants to make voyages that were dangerous and whose returns were good but not guaranteed. The Greenland Norse exported walrus ivory, furs, live polar bears for the collections of European nobles, and the labour of hunting and gathering these things occupied a significant portion of the community's energy. They imported the things that Greenland could not produce, grain above all, iron, timber, luxuries that signalled participation in the broader culture of the Norse world. When the supply chain worked, the community was viable. When it failed, for any reason, the community felt it immediately. Into this context, Thorfinn Karlsefni arrived with his ship and his goods and his genuine interest in opportunity, and found in Gudrid, the widowed daughter of a prosperous Icelander who had already demonstrated an unusual capacity for navigating difficult circumstances, exactly the partner that the Vinland project would require. Whether this was love in the sense the word carries now is a question the sagas cannot answer, because the sagas describe relationships in terms of their practical dimensions and their social consequences rather than their emotional texture. What is clear is that the two chose each other, in a context where choice was available to both of them, and built something together that lasted. The voyage to Vinland was the culmination of a series of earlier Norse explorations that the sagas describe with varying degrees of detail. Bjarni Herjolfsson had apparently sighted land to the west of Greenland before Leif Eriksson's voyage, though he had not landed. Leif had landed, explored, built temporary structures, and returned. Thorvald Eriksson, Leif's brother, had made a subsequent voyage and been killed by Skraelings, becoming the first European recorded to have died in conflict with North American indigenous people, a distinction that the sagas note without evident irony. Thorfinn and Gudrid's expedition was different in scale and intent. It brought families and livestock and the full material commitment of people who were not exploring, but settling. The sagas describe the Vinland of the permanent attempt as a landscape of extraordinary natural richness, with wild grapes and salmon and pasture that the Norse compared favourably to Greenland, which was itself a compliment that carried the baseline of Greenland's limitations. The country they had found was genuinely more hospitable than the country they had come from. That was not ultimately why it failed. The Skraelings who inhabited the North American coastline were not a single nation or a unified people, but a diversity of groups speaking different languages, organised differently, living in different relationships with their environment, and responding to the Norse arrival in ways shaped by those specific circumstances. The sagas describe the initial Norse reactions to them with the combined curiosity and contempt of people encountering something they do not have a framework for, and their attempts to establish workable relationships were handicapped from the beginning by the absence of common language, by the Norse tendency to treat unfamiliarity as inferiority, and by the structural impossibility of a small group of recent arrivals and a large resident population sharing a coastline without conflict over exactly the same resources. The trading relationship that briefly developed was the most interesting possibility, and the one most completely foreclosed by what followed. The exchange of Norse cloth for indigenous furs represented a genuine alignment of interests, each side having something the other wanted, which is the foundation of sustainable exchange. The breakdown came, as the sagas describe it, from the bull, from fear, from violence, from the fundamental incompatibility of two groups of people trying to occupy the same space under conditions where neither had reason to trust the other, and each had the capacity to cause the other serious harm. Gudrid navigated this situation for 3 years. The sagas give us glimpses of her doing so, in the scene with the Skraeling woman who sought her out, in the daily management of a settlement that was always one confrontation away from collapse, in the raising of an infant in a place where the nearest Norse community was days of sailing away across open water. She did these things, and then she came home, not in defeat exactly, but in the recognition that the experiment had reached its conclusion, and continuation was not worth the cost. The decision to leave Vinland was the correct decision. The Norse did not have the population, the political backing, or the willingness to absorb the level of sustained conflict that establishing a permanent presence on the North American continent would have required. What they had was the ability to see what they had found, to describe it, and to preserve that description in the oral tradition that eventually became the written sagas. The finding matters enormously. The going back matters too, in a different way, because it preserved the finders from a destruction that their continued presence would almost certainly have eventually produced. Gudrid went back, and then she went further, to Rome, the centre of the world she had moved to the edges of, the place that represented authority and continuity, and the theological weight of a faith she had held for most of her adult life. The pilgrimage was not tourism and not simply piety. It was, in the framework of medieval Christianity, a serious act of devotion with specific spiritual consequences, an acknowledgement of the sacred at the cost of significant physical hardship, which she had demonstrated repeatedly that she was equipped to undertake. She would have walked through the landscapes of Europe that she had never seen before, through cities and forests and mountain passes that were different in every way from Iceland and Greenland and Vinland, through communities speaking languages she did not know, through institutions she'd heard of but never encountered directly. She would have been, to the people she passed, simply a northern woman of middle age travelling toward Rome, unremarkable in the category of pilgrim if remarkable in the distance she had already covered before this journey began. No one she met on the road to Rome knew about Vinland. No one she met knew that the woman asking directions in awkward Italian, or gesturing through a language barrier to a French innkeeper, had already stood on a continent that Europe would not name for another 4 centuries. That gap between what she carried and what anyone around her knew is one of the strangest things about her life from the outside. She was carrying the largest secret in European history, except that it was not a secret. Not to her, not to the people who had been there, not to anyone in the Norse community she came from. It was simply something that had happened, that a group of people had gone somewhere and come back, and the knowledge of where they had gone existed in the form of oral tradition and family memory, and the sagas being composed in Iceland. It was not connected to the world of European maps and European ambitions and European institutions, and so it floated, separate, unabsorbed, waiting for a connection that would not arrive for 5 more centuries and would arrive by a completely different path. Gudrid arrived in Rome, completed her pilgrimage and went home. She built her anchor a cell, or her son built it for her, and she withdrew into it, and the world outside continued making history in the way the world does, continuously and without asking permission, and her part in it was finished. What remains is the story, which survived because people kept telling it, which is the oldest and most reliable form of survival available to people who lived before the age of printing or photography or digital archives. The story survived because it was worth telling, because something in it resisted forgetting, the way certain shapes resist forgetting, certain gestures, certain kinds of courage that the mind files in a place separate from ordinary experience because they are not ordinary and should not be stored as if they were. The story of a woman who went everywhere and then stopped and sat still and waited is a complete shape, whether or not it was recognized as complete in its own time. It is recognized now, that is its own kind of arrival. There is a particular kind of professional risk that most careers do not involve, which is the risk that your primary client will kill you if they feel insufficiently celebrated. Most jobs have performance reviews. Very few jobs have performance reviews conducted by someone wearing a sword in a hall full of people who also have swords and a strong interest in the outcome. This is, broadly speaking, the situation of the Viking skald. You are a skald. You have been one long enough to understand that the title is a description of a skill set, and also, depending on the evening, a description of a problem. The skill set is this. You compose poetry in Old Norse in a specific and technically demanding form called skaldic verse, which uses a metrical system of such complexity that learning to do it correctly takes years, and doing it under pressure in real time in front of an audience takes a combination of talent, preparation, and the kind of nerves that most people would prefer not to have tested in public. The problem is that your job is to praise powerful men accurately, and powerful men are complicated subjects, and the gap between what they did and what they want you to say they did is sometimes significant, and navigating that gap is how you stay alive. You're attached to a Jarl's household. The Jarl is a man of genuine power, which means he has done things that require celebrating, and things that require careful silence, and things that are technically celebratable, but only from a very specific angle, and part of your job is knowing which category each event falls into without being told. No one will brief you on this. No one will give you a list. You will learn it through observation, through the reactions of people in the hall when certain topics are mentioned, through the particular quality of the Jarl's silence when certain events are referenced, and through the accumulated wisdom of understanding that some victories are celebrated loudly, and some are celebrated quietly, and some are not mentioned at all. This morning you are composing. The Jarl has returned from a raid, successful in most of the ways that raids can be successful, and he has gathered his men in the hall tonight for the kind of celebration that successful raids produce, and you will be expected to perform. The poem you compose must do several things simultaneously. It must glorify the Jarl without sounding sycophantic, because sycophancy is noticed and contemptible. It must acknowledge the specific deeds of specific men in the hall without slighting anyone who expects to be mentioned and has the temperament to make that displeasure known. It must be technically correct, because a skaldic verse with a metrical error is an embarrassment not just to you but to the man you are praising, and an embarrassment in front of his warriors is not something most Jarls absorb with equanimity. And it must be good, not just adequate, actually genuinely good, in a tradition that values poetic excellence the way it values physical courage, because in the Norse world these things are not as separate as they might seem. Skaldic poetry is built around a metrical form called drotkvæet, which translates roughly as court meter, and which is exactly as demanding as that name implies. Each stanza has 8 lines. Each line has 6 syllables. 3 of those syllables are stressed. There are internal rhymes within individual lines and half-rhymes across lines. There are kennings, the compound metaphorical phrases that are the most distinctive feature of the form, two nouns joined to create a third meaning that refers to something else entirely. The sea is the whale rowed, blood is the sweat of the sword, gold is the fire of the arm, or the tears of Freya, or any of dozens of other circumlocutions that require the listener to do a small amount of interpretive work and reward them for doing it. A good kenning is elegant, surprising, and immediately comprehensible once you arrive at the meaning. A bad kenning is confusing at best and insulting at worst, and you have been composing them long enough to know the difference, though you have also been composing long enough to know that inspiration is not always reliable. You compose in your head while doing other things. This is the skaldic method, not because skalds are particularly gifted at multitasking, but because that is how the form was always taught, memorized and recited, and held in the mind before it was ever written down. The Norse had a complex relationship with writing, specifically with the runic alphabet, which existed but was used primarily for short inscriptions, not for long literary compositions. The sagas and the poems were oral first, written down later, sometimes much later, and the tradition of holding poetry in memory rather than on parchment shaped the form itself. Skaldic verse is so technically rigid partly because the rigidity makes it easier to remember. If a line has the wrong number of syllables, you know immediately because the pattern breaks. The constraint is also the container. You murmur lines under your breath while you walk to the well. You rework a kenning 3 times between the storehouse and the longhouse. You are never quite off duty, not really, because the composition is always happening somewhere in the background, like a fire that needs occasional feeding. By midday you have a stanza you're satisfied with, which means you're approximately 1/8 of the way through what tonight requires. You eat quickly and return to it. The subjects of your poem are not abstract. They are the men currently eating and drinking in the hall around you, and many of them will be listening tonight with the particular attention of people who expect to hear their own names, and who will notice if those names are absent, or present in insufficient quantity, or accompanied by the wrong kenning, or positioned in the wrong place in the poem, which can imply things about relative status that the composition may or may not intend. A Jarl's chief lieutenant expects to be second in the verse after the Jarl himself. A man who performed a specific notable deed expects that deed to be named. A man who made an error wants that error invisible. You're composing poetry, yes, but you're also managing a very delicate social ecosystem in verse form, and the margin for error is narrow in ways that most poets are not required to navigate. The Norse valued skalds enough to employ them at court, to keep them fed and housed and supplied with gifts, but the relationship was never comfortable in the way that employer-employee relationships can sometimes become comfortable. A skald who did his job well could expect generosity. A skald who failed, or who composed verses about the wrong things, or who used their position to say what they actually thought rather than what they were hired to say, could find the professional consequences significant. The sagas include examples of skalds who composed insulting verses about powerful men, and then discovered, sometimes immediately and sometimes after a slight delay, that the men had not appreciated the artistry. Evening arrives, the hall fills, the fire is large, the ale is flowing, and the noise of celebration has reached the particular pitch that suggests people have been celebrating for long enough that they are starting to feel the weight of their own good mood in their legs. The Jarl sits at the high seat. His men are arranged along the benches, slaves move through the space with food and drink, the dogs are underfoot. The smoke is everywhere, as it always is, the ambient condition of a Viking hall, as unavoidable as the noise and the smell of too many people gathered in a space that was built for gathering. You stand. The room does not go entirely silent, not immediately, but it quiets, because the appearance of the skald is a cue that something is about to happen that requires a certain quality of attention. The Jarl looks at you with the expression of a man who is genuinely curious but also reserves the right to be displeased. His men look at you with expressions that range from anticipation to the specific alertness of people waiting to hear their names. You begin. Your voice carries, trained for exactly this, not loud but clear and measured, finding the rhythm of the verse and holding it, the syllables falling into their pattern, the kennings arriving at the right moments, the names appearing in their proper order. You're not performing in the theatrical sense. You're transmitting, moving something you built in your head out into the room and into the people in it, and as you do it you are also watching, constantly watching, the way a performer always watches an audience looking for the signs of whether it is landing. The Jarl's expression shifts when his kenning arrives, the one you compose specifically for him, the one that calls him something that references both his lineage and his most celebrated quality, without either embarrassing flattery or insufficient acknowledgement. It is a good kenning. You know it is good because you revised it 4 times, and because when you hear it now in the hall it sounds inevitable, the way good lines always do when they work, as though they could not have been any other way. By the time you finish, the hall has the particular quality of a room where something was done well. The Jarl raises his cup. Men call out in appreciation. Someone near the back claps, which is not technically a Norse gesture of approval, but enthusiasm occasionally exceeds the available vocabulary. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. You return to your seat with the specific exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something very carefully for a long time and has now finally set it down. The gift comes later in the evening, a ring, silver, from the Jarl's own arm, removed and handed to you in front of the hall, which is itself a statement, a public acknowledgement of quality, a piece of the hall's social record as permanent as anything you composed tonight. You put it on. It is heavy and cold and considerable. You have earned it. Tonight that is what matters. But tomorrow you will begin composing again, because there is always a tomorrow in this profession, always another event that requires commemorating, another set of men whose deeds need to be arranged in the right order, inside a technically correct stanza. The work does not stop when the performance ends. It only pauses, long enough to breathe, long enough to remember what it felt like to do it well, and then it begins again. This is what you signed up for, more or less. You have never once regretted it. Most days. The technical demands of skaldic composition are worth sitting with a moment longer than a list of rules can convey, because the form is one of the most demanding in the history of literary production anywhere in the world, and understanding why it is so demanding changes what it means to watch someone do it well in front of an armed audience who have opinions. Drotkvaet, the court meter, requires that each stanza of 8 lines contain a specific pattern of stressed syllables, a specific pattern of internal rhyme within each line, and a specific pattern of half-rhyme between alternating lines. None of these patterns can be adjusted for convenience. The rhyme must fall on the correct syllable. The meter must scan correctly in a language that inflects its nouns and verbs in ways that give the poet some flexibility in word order, but not unlimited flexibility. And the flexibility that exists must be used in ways that serve both the technical requirements and the meaning being communicated. A poem that scans perfectly, but says nothing interesting, is a failure. A poem that says something interesting but scans incorrectly is an embarrassment that also says something uninteresting. The form requires both simultaneously, and it requires them in real time. The kenning system adds another layer. Kennings are not decoration. In skaldic verse, they are structural elements, doing the work of naming things that cannot be named directly without breaking the meter. The sea has many kennings, because the sea is mentioned frequently, and the word for sea in Old Norse has a particular phonetic shape that does not always fit where it needs to fit, so you call the sea the whale road, or the seal's home, or the ground of the gull, and you gain syllabic flexibility while also gaining expressive precision, because a good kenning is not a synonym but an angle of approach, a way of naming something that also says something about how it is being perceived. The whale road is not the same thing as the seal's home, even though they refer to the same body of water. They carry different tones, different associations, different implications about the poet's relationship to the subject. You have a mental catalogue of kennings that you have built over years of composition, and that you add to whenever you encounter something new and good. You also have kennings you have made yourself, compounds that you arrived at through the particular process of sitting with the subject long enough that something inevitable appears, something that feels like it was always there, and you simply failed to see it until now. The best kennings have that quality. The worst kennings are visible as construction, the seams showing, the effort audible in a way that good craft never allows. Tonight you're composing for a raid that went well, but well is a relative term in the raiding economy of the Viking Age, and the specifics of what happened require navigation. The raid achieved its primary objective. It returned with goods, with captives, with the kind of proof that a Jarl's warriors need to see that their effort and risk are producing results. But it also lost 3 men, and one of those men was the son of someone currently sitting in this hall, and that relationship to loss needs to be acknowledged without allowing the acknowledgement to dominate the celebration, because a hall that is primarily mourning has lost the social function that tonight is supposed to serve. You have been thinking about this problem for most of the day. The Norse were not sentimental about death in the way that later cultural traditions would become, but they were not indifferent to it either. A good death, a death in battle or on a raid, was something that could be celebrated within the larger framework of loss, incorporated into the honorific structure that the saga tradition used to make death meaningful. A man who died well in the service of his lord's ambitions was a man whose name could be spoken with pride by the man who sent him there. The Jarl needs the father to hear his son's name in a way that honours the son, and does not add to the father's grief by requiring him to grieve publicly in a celebration. This is the kind of problem that takes a whole day to solve in 6 syllables. The solution you arrive at is a kenning for the 3 men that frames their deaths as something given rather than taken, a gift to the gods or the fates rather than a loss to the living, which is both theologically coherent in the Norse framework and politically useful in the immediate social situation. You work it into the 7th stanza, after the main body of celebration has established the victory clearly enough that the pivot to loss can be absorbed as completion rather than interruption. You test the line in your head 20 times over the course of the afternoon. By evening it sounds right, which is to say it sounds like it was always there, and you only found it, which is the only test that matters. The hall is loud when you stand to perform, in the particular way that Viking halls get loud when celebration has been underway for enough time that everyone present has made peace with their own enthusiasm. The fire is enormous, the kind of fire that can only be built when wood is available, and comfort is the goal, and its light makes the faces in the hall into something immediate and present. The way firelight does, every face slightly dramatic, every shadow slightly meaningful. You catch the Jarl's eye before you begin. He gives you a look that contains several things simultaneously: expectation, authority. The mild tension of a man who knows the evening depends partly on what is about to happen, and who has enough confidence in you to let it happen without interference. This is a form of trust, and you feel its weight the way you feel the weight of the ring on your arm from the last time you performed well, a physical reminder that the job has consequences in both directions. The first stanza is the easiest, a formal acknowledgement of the occasion, the Jarl, the company, the purpose of the evening, which tradition requires and which you can execute without much conscious effort at this point in your career. Your voice finds the room quickly, as it usually does, the acoustic of the hall familiar, the response of the crowd to a skald rising to perform familiar, a kind of collective attention settling that is not quite silence, but is something functionally similar. The second stanza is where the raid begins to live in the verse, and this is where the real work is, because the raid needs to feel real to the people who are there, which means it needs the specific sensory texture of the actual thing, rather than the generic vocabulary of a generic raid. You use a kenning for the sea that references the colour of the water they crossed, a particular grey-green that the men who made the crossing will recognise immediately as the specific sea they were on rather than a poetic abstraction of the concept. This kind of specificity is what separates verse that is technically correct from verse that actually does what verse is supposed to do, which is make people feel the thing again while they are listening to you describe it. You watch the faces of the warriors as the raid comes alive in the verse. There is a particular quality of expression that comes over people when they're hearing something they experienced described accurately, a kind of slight stiffening followed by release, a recognition that travels through the body before it reaches the face. You see it moving through the hall as the stanzas build, men who are on the raid hearing their experience articulated in a form that will outlast the raid itself, will be retold and remembered and added to the body of things that the community knows about itself. The moment for the dead men approaches in the verse, and you feel the hall shift slightly before you speak the line, an anticipatory awareness that something is coming that requires a different quality of attention. You deliver it in the manner you rehearsed, not more slowly, not more softly, not with any of the theatrical signals that would make the moment feel performed rather than true. You let the kenning do its work. The hall is quiet for exactly the right length of time before the response begins, a murmur of acknowledgement that is the Norse equivalent of something understood. The father of the dead man is sitting 12 places down the bench to your left. You do not look at him directly while you speak the line. You look at the fire, which is the correct place to look when something difficult is being said, because fire is the neutral witness that does not require anyone to hold their expression. But in your peripheral vision you see him receive the line, and what you see is not grief exactly, but a kind of held breath, and then the breath releases, and he lifts his cup slightly, and that small gesture is the most complete response you could have hoped for. The remaining stanzas build back towards celebration, which is where the evening needs to end, in the particular Norse understanding of how grief and celebration can occupy the same space without cancelling each other. Because the world is both things, and life requires holding both at once, and an evening that cannot contain both is an evening that has lied about what life is. You have been a skald long enough to understand this not as a formal requirement of the genre, but as the actual truth it is trying to articulate. Death is real, and loss is real, and celebration is also real, and requiring that one of these things be absent before the others can exist is a refusal of the actual texture of being alive. The final stanza closes with the Jarl, as it must, with a kenning you compose specifically for him that references both his lineage and a quality of his leadership that the people in the hall know from experience to be true. Flattery that is also truth is not flattery. It is recognition, which is different, and which the Norse took seriously in a way that the debasement of the word flattery might obscure. Recognizing something real about a person, giving it words, making it part of the record is a genuine act with genuine stakes, and when it is done well, it carries a weight that goes beyond the moment of its performance. The applause, such as it is, comes in the form of rhythmic banging on the tables and the particular quality of approval that a Viking hall produces when it is satisfied, which is less polished than silence and more honest than anything else. The Jarl removes the ring from his arm. You receive it in front of the hall. The silver is cold and heavy and real in the way that material acknowledgement is real, and you feel, as you always feel in this moment, a kind of satisfaction that is not quite pride, but is the feeling that comes after doing something difficult and doing it correctly. The hall returns to celebration without you, which is as it should be. Your job was to make something happen and then step back from it, to be the mechanism rather than the subject, to give the evening its form and then allow the evening to inhabit the form you gave it. This is what skalds do. Not perform exactly. Build. Construct the container into which the night's meaning can pour, and then withdraw, and begin already in the quiet back of your mind where composition is always happening, thinking about what comes next. Because there is always a next. That is the shape of this life. Another feast, another victory, another loss to be handled carefully, another name that needs to be placed in a verse in exactly the right position, with exactly the right weight. You will compose it. You will find the kenning that makes it sound inevitable. You will stand in another hall and let your voice carry it into the room and watch the faces of people hearing something true said in a form that makes it permanent. You have been doing this long enough to know that the permanence is the point. Events happen and are forgotten. But a verse that scans, that holds its meaning in the architecture of its sound, that is passed from mouth to mouth through generations of people who could not have been there for the thing it describes, that lives. You will die the way everyone dies. The verse will not. This is the consolation of the form, and also its demand, and also why, on the mornings after the performances, when the ring is still cold on your arm and the hall is quiet and the fire is low, you sit with your eyes open, staring at the smoke-darkened ceiling and begin to build the next thing. The relationship between a skald and the court that employed them was not simply transactional, not purely the exchange of service for payment, though it was that too. It was something more complicated, a relationship with a social and emotional texture that the simple vocabulary of employer and employee does not capture. The skald lived with the household. He ate with them, travelled with them, witnessed the private moments that outsiders were not shown, and maintained over years a record of the family's history and character that no one else was positioned to hold. This proximity created intimacy, and intimacy with powerful people is never simple. You knew things about the Jarl that were not for general circulation. You had heard him speak in anger and in grief, and in the particular vulnerability that men of his kind occasionally allowed themselves in private. You had been present for decisions that went wrong, for moments of doubt, for the human texture of a life that in the public version was presented as consistent strength and authority. This knowledge was not a weapon exactly, not something you would ever use, but the fact of its existence changed the dynamic between you. He knew that you knew, and the performance of not knowing, of discretion maintained over years, was itself a form of service that he valued and rewarded. Skalds who left the service of one lord for another took their knowledge with them, which gave the second lord both the benefit of the skald's skill and the subtle awareness that this person had also left somewhere else and could potentially leave again. The Norse were realistic about human motivation in ways that do not romanticize loyalty, but do recognize its practical value. A loyal skald was worth more than a talented one, who might take their talent elsewhere when a better offer arrived. The combination of loyalty and talent was the rarest and most valuable configuration, and if you had it, you could name your terms to some degree and expect them to be met. The sagas record specific skalds by name and preserve specific verses attributed to them, which tells us something important about how Norse culture valued these people relative to, say, the craftspeople who built the ships or the farmers who fed the community. Skalds were remembered, their names attached to their verses. The verses survived the people who composed them in a way that made skaldic authorship something close to a form of individual immortality, a survival beyond death through the words that continued to be spoken after the speaker was gone. Egil Skallagrimsson is the most famous example of what a skald could be, and he is also the clearest demonstration of how much more complicated the role was in practice than any simple description can convey. Egil was a poet of extraordinary technical ability and a man of extraordinary violence in roughly equal measure. He composed some of the most celebrated verses in the Old Norse tradition, and also killed numerous people over the course of his life, sometimes in legal contexts that the Norse framework could accommodate, and sometimes in ways that pushed well beyond those contexts into something that even his contemporaries recognized as extreme. He feuded with King Eric Bloodaxe of Norway, was captured by him, and composed his most famous long poem, the Hofudlalen or Head Ransom, overnight, delivering it to Eric the following morning in exchange for his life. The poem worked. Eric let him go. A king who had every reason to kill him listened to the verses and did not kill him, because the verses were good enough, and because in the Norse world, acknowledging a great skald's greatness was itself a form of power, a demonstration that you were the kind of person who recognized excellence and could afford to respond to it with generosity rather than eliminating it. This is the other dimension of the skald's position that the simple description of court poet misses. A skald with genuine reputation was a kind of cultural power, not political power in the sense of armies or land or wealth, but the power of the person who controls the story. The Norse understood that how a man was remembered mattered, that the verse would outlast the man, that the reputation carried in the skaldic tradition was a real form of legacy that kings and jarls cared about deeply. A skald who praised you well gave you something that gold could not buy directly, even though gold was exactly what it cost to get the skald to do it. The transaction was commercial, but the product was not. This gave skalds a negotiating position that their formal social status did not quite explain. A skald was not a noble, not a warrior, not a merchant. He occupied a specialist role that the culture valued highly, but that did not fit cleanly into the standard hierarchies of Norse society. He sat near the high table, not at it, which was a social statement. He received gifts that a man of his formal standing would not normally receive, which was another statement. He moved through the hall with a kind of acknowledged presence that was different from how thralls moved or how visiting merchants moved, a recognition that he was there in a specific capacity that entitled him to specific treatment. In return, he was expected to be available when needed, to produce on demand rather than when inspiration struck, to find the verse that the occasion required even when the occasion was difficult, and the verse did not come easily. The romantic conception of the poet as someone who writes when moved and refuses to write when unmoved did not apply here. You were a professional. Professionals deliver. The composition process, for skalds who were doing their job well, was as much a matter of craft as inspiration, which is a statement that applies to all serious art, but that the skaldic tradition makes particularly obvious because its technical requirements are so explicit. You knew the form, you knew the kenning vocabulary, you knew the history and mythology that the kennings drew on, because a kenning that references a Norse myth requires the audience to know the myth, which the Norse audience did, and the school's job was to choose the myth reference that was most precisely right for the thing being described. This required a comprehensive education in the Norse mythological and literary tradition, which schools received through apprenticeship, through listening, through the years of exposure to other people's verse that preceded the attempt to produce your own. Young schools learned by memorizing. Every court had its body of existing verse, the compositions of previous schools who had served the household, or been composed in honour of the ancestors. A new skald was expected to know these, to have them available as part of the tradition within which their own work would eventually sit. Learning them was both homage and education, the form teaching itself through the best examples of itself, the kennings embedding themselves in memory until they became the natural vocabulary of the form rather than deliberate choices. Your own first compositions were terrible in the way that all first compositions are terrible, technically adequate in the places where technical adequacy was most obviously measurable and fundamentally lifeless in the places where technique alone cannot carry you. You knew the rules, but you had not yet learned to make the rules invisible, had not yet achieved the fluency where the constraints of the form became the natural shape of the thought, rather than a cage you were composing inside. That took years. It takes years for everyone. The ones who give up before it comes are skalds who did not wait long enough. The ones who achieve it discover something that is genuinely difficult to describe to people who have not experienced it. A state where the form is not something you are working against, but something you are working with. Where the syllable count and the rhyme pattern feel like the natural dimensions of the thought rather than restrictions imposed from outside. You are in that place now. You have been in it long enough that you can feel the difference between a line that is working and a line that is not working, almost before it is finished, can tell in the first two syllables whether the metrical pattern is going to resolve into something right or something that needs to be rebuilt. This is what expertise feels like from the inside, not confidence exactly, but a kind of fluency, a relationship with the material that has moved past the stage where everything requires conscious calculation, and into the stage where the calculation happens below the surface, leaving the conscious mind free to think about what the verse is trying to do rather than how to do it. Tonight was a good performance. Not every performance is good. Some are adequate, which is the professional's version of failure, the performance that does what it needs to do without doing what it was supposed to do, which is make something feel true. Adequacy is survivable but not satisfying, and in a career built on satisfaction, adequate accumulates badly. Tonight was good. You felt the difference while you were performing, and you feel it now, sitting with the ring on your arm and the hall quieter around you. Tomorrow you begin again. The Viking thing, the assembly at the heart of Norse political life, sounds straightforward enough when you describe it from a distance. Free men gathered on a regular basis to make collective decisions, settle disputes, and maintain the legal order of their community. It was, by the standards of the early medieval world, a genuinely remarkable institution. While most of Europe was operating under systems where power flowed downward from kings and lords and was not meaningfully accountable to the people it governed, the Norse had developed something that at least resembled popular participation. They held it up as a source of pride. They built identities around it. Iceland, in particular, established its Althing in the year 930, making it one of the oldest continuing parliaments in the world, a fact that Icelanders still cite with appropriate satisfaction. All of that is true, and it requires a second examination. The thing, at its most basic, was a meeting. It happened outdoors, usually in a designated place, often a flat open area where a large number of people could gather. In Iceland, the Althing met at Thingvellir, a dramatic landscape of volcanic plains and rift valleys, where a natural escarpment called the Law Rock served as the speaking platform from which the law speaker recited the laws aloud to the assembled crowd. In Norway and in the settlements across the Norse world, regional things operated at the local level, with cases and disputes brought before the assembled freemen for judgment. The system was layered. Local things fed into regional ones, which in theory connected to something approaching a broader legal framework, though the coherence of that framework depended heavily on where you were and who was in charge of maintaining it. The law speaker was the institutional memory of the system. Because the Norse did not write down their laws in comprehensive form until relatively late, the laws existed in living memory, held and recited by a specialist whose job was to know all of them and to speak them correctly. The law speaker served a fixed term, traditionally 3 years, though the position was prestigious enough that continuity was common. He was not a judge in the modern sense. He did not decide cases. He recited the applicable law so that the assembly could apply it. The distinction sounds technical, and it is, but it matters, because it means the deciding was always done collectively, always by the assembled free men, which sounds democratic right up until you look at who those free men were and what they were carrying when they arrived to make their decisions. Free men, in the Norse world, meant men who were not thralls, and who owned enough property to participate in the community as independent actors. This was not a small category exactly, but it was a strictly bound. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Women did not participate in the thing as decision makers. Thralls did not participate. People who had lost their legal standing through outlawry did not participate. The men who showed up to make the collective decisions of Norse society were, in other words, the men who already had power, already had property and already had weapons, because attending the thing armed was not just permitted but normal, and the visual effect of a large gathering of armed property-owning men reaching collective judgments about disputes is something that deserves slow consideration. The thing was also, by design, a social event. People travelled considerable distances to attend. They brought their households, their disputes, and their trading goods. Business was conducted, alliances were made, marriages were negotiated, feuds were escalated or resolved or elaborately deferred. The atmosphere was not the quiet decorum of a courtroom. It was the atmosphere of a large outdoor gathering that happened to include legal proceedings, which meant that the boundary between legal argument and social pressure was porous in ways the formal description of the institution did not capture. A dispute brought before the thing was presented by the parties involved, who were expected to argue their own cases, though they could have supporters speak on their behalf. The applicable law was cited. The assembled men listened, and then they decided. The mechanism of decision was not a formal vote in the modern sense. It was closer to consensus read from the reaction of the crowd, the volume and direction of support, the willingness of enough men to declare themselves in favour of a particular outcome. This system worked reasonably well when the case was clear, and the parties were of roughly equal standing. It worked less well in other situations. The problem with a legal system that depends on collective agreement among armed men is that collective agreement among armed men is not structurally separable from collective armed agreement. A man who brought a case to the thing against a more powerful opponent was not operating in a neutral legal environment. He was operating in an environment where his opponent potentially knew more of the assembled men personally, where his opponent's allies could visibly support a particular outcome, where the social weight of the room could shift before a word of law was spoken. The Norse were not unaware of this. The sagas are full of cases where the legal outcome was predetermined by the power dynamics of the community, where justice was less a neutral principle and more a description of what powerful men had agreed to ratify. Outlawry was the most dramatic expression of the thing's reach. A man declared an outlaw, either for a fixed term or for life, lost the protection of the law entirely. He could be killed by anyone without legal consequence. His property could be seized. His family could be left destitute. It was, in practical terms, a sentence of death by community withdrawal, and it was among the most severe punishments the system could impose, because what it took away was not just freedom or property, but the entire framework of social belonging within which a person existed. The most famous outlaw in Norse history is also the founder of Greenland. Eric the Red was outlawed from Iceland for 3 years after a killing that escalated from a property dispute, in a way that disputes in Viking Age Iceland had a tendency to do. Rather than die or flee without purpose, he used his term of outlawry to sail west and explore, found a settlement, and returned to Iceland when his time was up, inviting anyone interested to join him in a place he had strategically named Greenland rather than something more accurate. His outlawry, in other words, produced a new colony. The thing had intended a punishment. It produced an expedition. The settlement of Iceland itself was partly the product of political outlawry at a different scale. Many of the original settlers had left Norway under pressure from Harald Fairhair's consolidation of power, the establishment of a centralised kingship that made Norway a less comfortable place for men who preferred to be accountable to no one above themselves. The thing in Iceland was partly a way of replicating the kind of local autonomy that had existed in Norway before the king got involved. It was an institution designed by people who had experienced centralised power and had decided collectively that they preferred to govern themselves by gathering outdoors and arguing about it. This preference had genuine merit and genuine limitations. The thing gave Norse communities a mechanism for dispute resolution that was at least theoretically available to anyone with legal standing. It created a public record of agreements and judgments. It maintained the idea that law was something that belonged to the community rather than being handed down from above. These were not trivial achievements. In the context of the early medieval world, they were remarkable. But the thing also normalised a specific kind of power, the power of men with weapons and social networks and property, and it built that normalisation into the structure of the legal system itself. Cases were decided not by impartial judges, but by the community, and the community was not neutral. It was composed of people with relationships, debts, alliances, feuds, and opinions that preceded and followed every case that came before them. Justice was available, but its availability was shaped by where you stood in the social order before you arrived to seek it. The Norse were aware of the gap between legal ideal and social reality in ways the sagas make clear. The sagas are full of people who win their cases legally and lose them practically, who are technically in the right, but cannot enforce their right because their opponent has more allies and is willing to use them. The response to this was often more violence, more feud, a cycle in which the legal resolution produced by the thing was revisited through extra-legal means by the party that felt wrongly treated. The thing had the authority to make decisions. It did not always have the power to make those decisions stick. What the thing actually was, as opposed to what it presented itself as being, was something genuinely complex. It was a legal institution, and a social gathering, and a display of collective power, and a marketplace, and a site of negotiation, and a place where the fiction of equal justice and the reality of unequal power existed side by side, and everyone involved understood both things simultaneously, and chose, most of the time, to operate within the fiction, because the fiction was useful, and the alternative was either total submission to a king or a level of social chaos that even Viking society found unpleasant. The Althing in Iceland continued operating in recognisable form for centuries. Christianity arrived in Iceland in the year 1000, decided by vote at the Althing, a moment of collective legal decision-making that produced a religious conversion, the only conversion of an entire nation achieved primarily through parliamentary procedure rather than conquest or coercion. That detail is so Norse that it deserves a moment of quiet appreciation. They voted on their god, and the vote was close, and the outcome was managed through compromise, and then they went home. The thing produced a new Iceland. It usually produced something. Whether what it produced was justice depended, as it tends to, on who was asking. The geography of the thing matters more than it might seem. The Norse did not hold their assemblies in enclosed spaces, in buildings that could be controlled and monitored, and whose access could be restricted. They held them outdoors, in designated landscape features, often at places that had been used for the purpose for generations, where the rock or the plain or the valley had accumulated the weight of previous decisions and become, through repetition, something close to sacred. Thingvellir in Iceland is the most famous of these sites, and standing there now, even now when it's a national park with a visitor centre and a flag flying for the modern Icelandic state, you can feel why the Norse chose it. The escarpment, the law rock, the plains stretching out from it, the quality of the light in the northern summer, the way sound carries across that particular landscape, all of it conspires to make the human gathering there feel both small and important simultaneously. The land contains the people, and also gives their gathering a frame that suggests permanence. That permanence was intentional. The thing was not supposed to be a temporary institution, a provisional solution to the problem of social organisation. It was supposed to be the solution, the framework within which Norse society maintained itself against the tendencies toward disorder that any concentration of armed, independent-minded people produces. The law speaker reciting the laws aloud every year was not simply an information delivery mechanism. It was a ritual of renewal, a collective affirmation that these laws existed, that the community had agreed to them, and that the community continued to agree to them by showing up and listening. The showing up was itself significant. Attendance at the thing was not optional in any practical sense for free men of standing. To fail to appear was to signal either illness or contempt, and contempt was a statement that had consequences. It was also an absence from the social network that formed and reformed at every assembly, the marriages arranged and alliances confirmed and deals struck in the margins of the legal proceedings. The thing was never only about the law, it was about the community constituting itself as a community, visibly, publicly, in the presence of its own membership. Women were present at the thing. This is worth saying clearly because the common assumption, shaped partly by how the formal legal proceedings are described, is that the thing was an exclusively male space. In fact, women of free status attended, participated in the social life of the assembly, were present for the legal proceedings, and in the household of a man bringing or defending a case, had often been deeply involved in the strategy and preparation of that case before it ever reached the public forum. The Norse sagas are full of women advising their husbands on legal tactics, negotiating with opposing parties, and in some cases driving the decision to pursue legal action in the first place. But formal legal standing, the right to bring a case yourself, to be the plaintiff or defendant rather than the supporter of one, was restricted to free men, specifically men who had not lost that standing through outlawry or other legal disability. A woman could not stand before the thing and argue her own case. She needed a male legal representative, a guardian or kinsman or husband to do it for her. This was not always a limitation in practice, because the representative could simply convey exactly what the woman instructed him to say, but the requirement was structural, and the gap between formal inclusion and formal exclusion mattered in the cases, not rare, where the woman's legal interests diverged from those of the man who was supposed to represent her. The legal cases themselves range from the simple to the extraordinarily complex. Property disputes, inheritance conflicts, claims of unpaid debt, accusations of theft or fraud, all of these were standard business. But the thing also handled the cases that the Norse considered most serious: killings. Murder, in the modern legal sense of intentional unlawful killing, was distinguished in Norse law from manslaughter and from what we might call justified killing, and the distinction had profound consequences for how a case was handled and what outcome was available. The Norse legal system had a concept of nithingr, a person so dishonoured by their actions that they had forfeited the protection of the community, and conversely a robust framework for what constituted a legitimate killing. A man who killed another man could, in some circumstances, declare the killing openly, and avoid the most serious legal consequences if the killing could be shown to have been justified. The disclosure had to happen quickly, before the sun set on the day of the killing according to some sources, and the declaration had to be made formally. A killing that was hidden, that was not declared, became by definition a murder, regardless of the circumstances, because the secrecy itself was the violation. This framework created a legal culture that was in some ways more transparent about violence than modern legal systems. Norse law did not pretend that killing never happened, or that the community had no tools for managing it when it did. It built a set of rules around the management of violence, attempted to distinguish between kinds of killing, and created forums for negotiating the social consequences. At the same time, the rules operated within a context where the forum itself was filled with armed men, where the losing party in a legal case was not necessarily bound by the outcome in any practical sense, and where the enforcement of a judgment depended on the power of the people behind the judgment, rather than any neutral state apparatus that could compel compliance. Compensation was the primary remedy in many Norse legal cases. Rather than imprisonment or corporal punishment, the preferred resolution of a killing or serious injury was the payment of wergild, a set compensation based on the social status of the person harmed. The amount was fixed by law, negotiated within those parameters, and intended to settle the grievance in a way that allowed the families involved to move forward without the alternative, which was feud. Feud, in the Norse world, was not a failure of the legal system. It was the state of affairs that the legal system was designed to prevent or to interrupt, the cycle of retaliatory killing that a society of armed, honour-conscious people without a central state monopoly on violence tended to produce. The problem was that the legal system's ability to prevent feud depended on both parties accepting the outcome, and acceptance depended on the outcome feeling just, and whether an outcome felt just depended on whether the people involved felt they had been fairly treated by a process they experienced as legitimate. When one party felt the process was tilted, when they felt their case had been heard by people who were already disposed to decide against them, The legal resolution was simply the formal declaration of a result that one side did not accept, and the feud continued in a slightly different key. The sagas document this dynamic with the matter-of-factness of people who lived inside it and understood it as the normal texture of things rather than a failure of an ideal. Men who won cases legally found themselves still needing to defend those wins by force. Men who lost cases brought violence that the winners then had to respond to, creating a situation where legal and physical conflict existed in parallel, each referencing the other, neither one capable of fully resolving what the other one raised. The thing was the forum where resolution was attempted. It was not always the place where resolution was achieved. The concept of outlawry deserves extended attention because it was among the most socially radical things the Norse legal system could do, and it was applied with a frequency that suggests it was not an exceptional measure, but a routine tool of the assembly's authority. An outlaw was not a criminal in the modern sense of someone imprisoned and managed by state authority. An outlaw was someone from whom the community withdrew its protection entirely, leaving them legally killable by anyone who encountered them, their property forfeit, their social existence erased. The practical consequences of outlawry depended enormously on what resources and relationships the outlaw had before the sentence was passed. A man with loyal kinsmen, with wealth, with connections in other communities or other regions, could survive outlawry in ways that a man without those resources could not. The law said that anyone could kill an outlaw without consequence. The social reality was that killing the kinsman of a powerful family was still a dangerous act, and the family of an outlawed man might well retaliate even when retaliation was technically without legal justification. The formal withdrawal of protection did not automatically translate into the practical absence of protection, because the social networks that provided protection were not identical to the legal system that could be withdrawn by the thing's decision. Eric the Red's outlawry from Iceland produced Greenland. Gunnar of Hlíðarendi, one of the most celebrated figures in the saga tradition, was outlawed by the Althing and then famously refused to leave Iceland, turning back at the last moment after looking at his home and deciding he could not go. He was killed at home rather than in exile, which the sagas present as a kind of honour, the man who could not leave his land dying on it, which is a romantic reading of what was also a failure to comply with the legal system's decision. The saga's admiration for Gunnar's choice is revealing. The thing had decided. Gunnar had refused. And the saga, composed within a culture that both valued the thing as an institution and valued individual honour above almost everything, is not sure which to admire more. That ambivalence is the most honest thing about the Norse legal system. It was genuinely impressive, genuinely participatory, in ways that most of the early medieval world was not, and it was also genuinely imperfect in ways that its admirers sometimes prefer to minimise. The freedom it protected was the freedom of men who had property and weapons and standing. The justice it dispensed was the justice of communities in which power was unevenly distributed, and the forum that was supposed to be neutral was in practice made of the same unequal social material as everything else. Christianity arrived in Iceland in the year 1000 by decision of the Althing, and this decision is the clearest possible illustration of both the thing's genuine authority and the social reality within which that authority operated. The Icelandic community was divided between Christians and pagans, and the division was creating legal and social conflicts that the existing framework could not cleanly resolve, because the two groups held different views about what oaths meant and what sacrifice required and whose gods were binding on everyone. A lawless solution seemed to be approaching. The resolution was assigned to the law speaker, Thorgeir Ljósvetningagodi, who was himself pagan. He took his cloak and lay under it for a full day, and then he emerged and announced his decision, which was that Iceland would be Christian, with certain private allowances for the old practices, a compromise that preserved the unity of the legal community by creating a single framework that both sides could operate within, however unhappily. The decision was accepted. Iceland converted. Not because the religion had persuaded everyone, not because any military force had been applied, but because the Althing had decided, and the authority of the thing's decision was sufficient to compel compliance from people who disagreed with the outcome. This is the thing at its most functional, the assembly achieving something genuinely difficult through the exercise of collective authority that both sides accepted as legitimate. It is also, if you look carefully, a decision made by one man, the law speaker, who spent a day alone and emerged with a conclusion. The community deferred to him. The form of collective decision-making produced a result that a single person determined. This is not a critique of Thorgeir, who was clearly trying to serve the community as he understood that service, and who produced a decision that worked, in the sense that Iceland's conversion proceeded without the civil conflict that had seemed imminent. But it is a reminder that collective institutions are always operated by specific people, and the quality of those institutions is inseparable from the quality of the people in them, and the people in them are never the idealized citizens that the institutions pretend they are. They are people, with their own interests and relationships and blind spots and capacities, doing their best with what they have in the situations they find themselves in. The thing did its best. It was, in the long run of history, worth having. It produced a legal culture that valued argument over simple force, that gave communities a way to resolve disputes without defaulting immediately to violence, that maintained a concept of collective authority that would eventually, through the long, strange path of historical accident, contribute something to the democratic traditions that modern societies value. That contribution is real and should not be minimized. It was also a room full of armed men, deciding things about each other based on social relationships and power dynamics that the legal form could only partially contain. Both of these things were true, at the same time, about the same institution. History is mostly both things at the same time. The space between the ideal and the reality is where people actually lived, and the Norse, who had a high tolerance for the complicated, for the morally ambiguous, for the story that does not resolve cleanly into heroes and villains, were perhaps better equipped than most to live in that space without pretending it was something simpler. The seasonal quality of the thing matters to understanding its social function. It was not a year-round institution, but a summer gathering, held at the time of year when travel was possible, when the long Norse days provided light enough to conduct business across the hours, when the agricultural calendar had a gap between the planting and the harvest that allowed people to leave their farms for the days or weeks the assembly required. This timing was not incidental. It structured the thing as an event rather than a continuous institution, something anticipated and prepared for and arrived at with the sense of occasion that seasonal gatherings carry. People travelled to the thing from considerable distances. In Iceland, where the Elthing drew attendees from across the entire island, this could mean journeys of several days, families making the trip together, bringing the household's legal business and social calendar along with them. The gathering was therefore also a reunion, a reconnection of people who spent most of the year in the relative isolation of their own farms, and who only saw certain faces when the summer brought everyone to the same place. The social business conducted at the thing was, in volume, probably greater than the legal business. Marriages were arranged at the thing, with families negotiating the terms that made a match appropriate, the dowry, the bride price, the allocation of property in the event of death or divorce. Trading deals were struck because the concentration of people in one place for an extended period created a market that was more efficient than any individual farm could access on its own. Old friendships were renewed and new ones made. Feuds that had been simmering through the winter were either brought to legal resolution or occasionally escalated into confrontations that the legal process then had to manage. The thing, in other words, was a social engine as much as a legal one, and separating these two functions is impossible because they were not separate. The legal proceedings were embedded in the social context, and the social context was shaped by the legal proceedings, and the outcome of cases was influenced by the social relationships and social dynamics of the community in ways that the formal legal framework neither fully acknowledged nor fully controlled. Foreigners who attended the thing, merchants from the continent or from England, traders whose ships had brought them to Icelandic ports, sometimes left accounts of what they observed that read, with the slight bafflement of people trying to describe a system they recognise in outline but cannot quite make sense of in practice. They noted the orderliness of the proceedings alongside the constant presence of weapons. They noted the apparent equality of participants alongside the obvious deference given to certain figures. They noted the outdoor setting, which seemed to them incongruous with the seriousness of what was being decided, as if the absence of a building somehow made the decisions less real. The Norse, of course, did not share this intuition. Buildings could burn, buildings could be owned and therefore controlled. The open air was not owned by anyone, which made it, in the Norse framework, the most neutral possible setting for proceedings that were supposed to represent the community rather than any faction within it. The landscape itself was the guarantor of collective ownership, which was a different kind of symbolism from the courthouse or the Great Hall, and a more honest one in some ways because it acknowledged that the thing happened outdoors, in the weather, under conditions that everyone shared equally, rather than in a building that someone had built and that someone therefore in some sense controlled. The legal language used at the thing was itself a form of performance, required to be precise and formally correct in ways that modern legal proceedings also require, but that the Norse invested with a particular rigidity. A case that was argued using the wrong formula, that omitted a required element, that was presented in the wrong sequence, could be dismissed on procedural grounds regardless of its merits, which created a premium on knowing the forms and a corresponding disadvantage for people who lacked access to that knowledge. Legal expertise was itself a kind of power, and like all kinds of power in the Norse world, it was distributed unevenly. The chieftains, the godar, who were the primary political figures of Icelandic society, held their authority partly through their role in the legal system, through the obligation of their followers to attend the thing under their leadership, and through their responsibility to prosecute cases on behalf of those followers. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. This created a client relationship that was different from simple lordship, more mutual and more negotiated, but that still concentrated legal power in the hands of a relatively small number of families whose knowledge, connections and resources gave them structural advantages in every aspect of the legal process. The conversion of Iceland decided at the thing demonstrated both the institution's genuine authority and the ways in which that authority was exercised by specific people rather than emerging organically from the collective. The peaceful resolution of the Christian-pagan conflict was a genuine achievement, and it established a precedent for managing religious diversity that was, in its time, remarkably sophisticated. But it was also a decision made under pressure, in a situation where the alternative to compromise was open conflict, and the wisdom of the decision is inseparable from the urgency of the circumstances that made compromise necessary. That pattern, the institution functioning best when the alternatives were worst, is recognizable to anyone who has watched collective decision-making in any era. The thing worked when working was necessary. It struggled when the stakes were lower or when the powerful had less to lose from ignoring it. It was an institution, and institutions are only as good as the situations that compel people to take them seriously. What the Norse built was not perfect. What they built was real, an actual mechanism for collective decision-making in the open air among armed men who had agreed to govern themselves by something other than simple force, who showed up every summer to argue about things that mattered to them in a language that had been developed specifically for the purpose of arguing about things clearly. That the language was sometimes manipulated, that the armed men sometimes forgot their agreement, that the mechanism was imperfect in ways that sometimes allowed the powerful to take from the less powerful under a legal cover that disguised the transaction as justice. None of this cancels what was also true. Something was being attempted. Something partially worked. The attempt deserves to be seen as an attempt, with its limits and its genuine achievements both in frame, because flattening it in either direction into pure democratic ideal or pure cynical performance loses the actual thing, which was human, which was complicated, which was both. There is one more thing about the thing worth sitting with, which is its failure mode when it failed completely, when the assembled community decided that a person or a family was so far outside the bounds of acceptable behaviour that ordinary legal remedies were insufficient. The killing of an outlaw was legal, but killing required proximity, and proximity required courage, and the person being killed was rarely without defenders even in outlawry. The gap between the legal reality and the physical one was where Norse society most clearly showed its seams, where the confident framework of the assembly met the messy reality of people with weapons and loyalties and the complicated emotions that run through communities that have known each other for generations. A man outlawed by the thing was not simply abandoned. He was still someone's son, someone's kinsman, someone's neighbour across the valley for the last 20 years. The community that declared him outside the law was made of people who remembered him before he was outside it, who had opinions about whether the case against him was fair, who had their own interests in the outcome of his situation. Outlawry was the law's most extreme statement, and like most extreme statements, it lived in a context that complicated its implementation. The Norse knew this. The sagas are full of it. And they kept having the thing anyway, kept assembling every summer, kept arguing about cases in the open air beside the law rock, kept choosing to govern themselves through the imperfect machinery of collective decision-making rather than accepting the alternative, which was simply whoever was strongest determining all outcomes without process. The process mattered even when it failed. The attempt at law mattered even when law was defeated by force. You keep building the thing you're trying to build imperfectly, in the knowledge that the alternative is worse. This is the Norse lesson, and it is not a comfortable one, but it is a real one. And so tonight's journey ends here, in the long, complicated shadow of the Viking world, which was never quite what it looked like from either direction. Not the romantic heroism of the saga tradition, where every man is brave and every death is noble, and the North Atlantic is just a scenic backdrop for people with good posture and excellent hair. And not the simple brutality of the other popular image, all violence and conquest and beard, flattened into something legible and therefore wrong. The reality was always more tangled, more human, more interesting than either version allows. There was Gudrid, crossing oceans in an era when crossing oceans was supposed to be a thing that men did, raising a son on a continent that Europe did not yet have a name for, walking to Rome and back and then settling into a convent, as if all of that was simply the natural arc of a single life. There was the Skald, standing in a smoky hall with a silver ring and a head full of carefully metered praise, managing the social economy of a powerful man's ego in 6-syllable lines. There was the Thing, assembling under the open sky to practice something that resembled justice, that was sometimes justice, and that was always, underneath, a negotiation between what the law said and what the men with weapons were willing to agree to. And there was the Thrall, waking before dawn, reading the room, surviving one day at a time, holding on to the small things because the small things were available and the large things were not. What connects them is not a romantic thread, but a practical one. Every single person in this world was navigating a system that existed before they arrived and would continue after they were gone. A system with its own logic, its own hierarchies, its own gaps between what it claimed to be and what it actually was. And within those systems, people did what people always do. They looked for the rules, they tested the edges, they found small dignities where large ones were not available. They were kinder to each other than the system required, and sometimes crueler, and often both within the same afternoon. The Viking world is over in the sense that the longships have been gone for 1,000 years, and the Thing has evolved beyond recognition, and the Thrall system has no direct successor that any modern society would openly defend. But the human texture of it is not over, because the human texture is never over. The person calculating the hierarchy of an unfamiliar room on their first day somewhere new is doing something thralls understood. The professional trying to figure out how to praise someone powerful without becoming sycophantic is doing something the Skalds understood. The citizen sitting in an assembly that claims neutrality, while visibly favouring the people with the most resources, is doing something the thing's participants understood. We carry these shapes with us, not because history repeats itself in any simple sense, but because the problems history was trying to solve are the same problems we are still trying to solve, just in different rooms, with different tools, wearing different clothes. The cold is different, the smoke is different, the specific quality of exhaustion is different. But the negotiation between self and system, between what is asked and what can be given, between the official version of things and the actual version, that negotiation is constant. It does not require a longship, it just requires being alive and paying attention. So let all of that settle now gently, without urgency. Let the hall go quiet and the fire go low and the Thing adjourn for the evening. Let the poem finish and the audience disperse into the night. Let the longhouse settle around its inhabitants, free and unfree, each of them horizontal now, each of them breathing in the smoke and the animal warmth and the complicated air of a world that asked a great deal and offered, in return, the singular satisfaction of having endured it one more day. That is not a small thing, it never was. Rest now. The road, whatever road you're on, will still be there in the morning. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. See you on the next one.